Martin Lasker sat on the couch, scrolling mindlessly through social media while the faint sound of the TV played in the background. His wife, Clara, had gone out for the evening to see one of her favorite bands, a spur-of-the-moment plan that she'd mentioned over breakfast. "I'll just go alone," she had said with a shrug. "None of my friends are free, and you hate crowded concerts." Martin had nodded, distracted by his coffee and the morning news. He didn't think much of it. Clara had always been independent, and their relationship thrived on giving each other space. But now, hours later, as Martin's phone buzzed with notifications, and he scrolled through photos of friends and acquaintances, a particular image stopped him cold. It was a selfie posted by a man named Elliot Langston. Martin didn't know him personally, but they had mutual friends. Elliot was grinning in the picture, a sea of concertgoers behind him, the stage lights glowing in the distance. And there, in the background, unmistakably, was Clara. She wasn't alone. Martin stared at the photo, his stomach twisting. Clara was standing close to another man, her face turned toward him, smiling in a way that sent a jolt of unease through Martin's chest. The man had his arms slung casually over her shoulders, their proximity far too intimate for comfort. The caption beneath Elliot's photo read, "Great night at the show. Awesome crowd. Good vibes." Martin's hand tightened around his phone. He opened Clara's text thread, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. She'd sent him a message an hour earlier. "Having such a great time. Love you, Redheart." He hadn't thought much of it then, but now it felt like a mockery. Martin spent the next hour scrutinizing the photo. He zoomed in and out, replaying the scene in his mind. Who was the man with Clara? Why hadn't she mentioned meeting someone? And why did she look so comfortable with him? When Clara walked through the door just after midnight, humming one of the band's songs under her breath, Martin was waiting for her in the living room. "Hey, you're up," she said, surprised. "You didn't have to wait for me." "I wasn't waiting," Martin replied evenly, holding up his phone. "I was scrolling through social media." Clara paused, her smile faltering. "Okay, I saw something interesting," Martin continued, his voice calm but sharp. He turned the screen toward her, displaying the photo of Elliot's selfie. "Care to explain this?" Clara's eyes widened as she stared at the image. For a moment, she didn't say anything, and Martin felt the tension in the room grow heavier. "Martin," she began, her voice wavering. "It's not what it looks like." "Then tell me what it is," Martin said, his jaw tight. Clara hesitated, her gaze flicking between him and the phone. "That's just a guy I ran into at the concert. I didn't go with him. We bumped into each other, that's all." Martin raised an eyebrow. "Bumped into each other?" "He has his arm around you, Clara. That's not exactly casual." "It wasn't like that," Clara insisted, her voice rising. "We talked for a bit, and he asked to take a picture. I didn't even know it was being posted online." "And who is he?" Martin pressed. Clara bit her lip, her hesitation sending another wave of doubt through Martin. "Just a guy named Nate," she said finally. "He's a friend of a friend." "A friend of a friend?" Martin repeated. "So you conveniently ran into this friend of a friend at a concert you claim to be going to alone?" Clara crossed her arms defensively. "Why are you making this such a big deal?" "It was nothing, Martin. You're blowing this out of proportion." Martin stared at her, his chest tight with anger and confusion. "You're being defensive because you know how bad this looks. And the fact that you didn't tell me about him makes it worse." Clara shook her head, frustration flashing in her eyes. "I didn't tell you because it wasn't important. Are you seriously accusing me of something just because I took a picture with someone? I don't know what I'm accusing you of yet. Martin said coldly. But this doesn't add up, Clara. Not one bit. The conversation ended with Clara retreating to their bedroom, slamming the door behind her. Martin stayed in the living room, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the image of Clara and Nate, couldn't stop replaying the look on her face as she stood beside him. Something was wrong, he could feel it, and he wasn't going to rest until he found out the truth. Martin barely slept that night. He lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, the faint glow of his phone casting shadows across the room. The image of Clara and Nate in the background of that selfie was burned into his mind, and her evasive answers replayed like a broken record. By morning, Martin's frustration had hardened into resolve. If Clara wasn't going to tell him the truth, he would find it himself. Clara was already up when Martin walked into the kitchen, the smell of coffee filling the air. She stood at the counter, scrolling through her phone, her expression tense. "Morning," she said without looking up. "Morning," Martin replied curtly, pouring himself a cup of coffee. The tension between them was palpable, the air thick with unspoken words. Martin watched her out of the corner of his eye, noting the stiffness in her posture and the way her fingers gripped her phone a little too tightly. "You've been quiet," Clara said after a moment, her tone cautious. "So have you," Martin countered. "Anything you want to say?" Clara hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I told you everything last night, Martin. There's nothing more to say." Martin set his cup down, his jaw tightening. "Then why does it still feel like you're hiding something?" Clara turned to face him, her eyes flashing with frustration. "Because you won't let it go. I've explained everything, and you're still acting like I committed some terrible crime. Maybe because your story doesn't add up." Martin shot back. "You expect me to believe you just ran into this guy, that you just happened to be close enough to take a picture like that? Come on, Clara. I'm not stupid." Her face flushed, and for a moment, she looked like she might argue. But instead, she turned away, shaking her head. "I'm not doing this," she muttered. Martin clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. "You're not doing this because you know I'm right. You're hiding something, Clara, and until you're honest with me, I'm not dropping it." After Clara left for work, Martin sat at the dining table, his coffee forgotten. He opened his laptop and began searching for anything he could find about Nate. He didn't know much, just a first name and a face from the selfie, but it was enough to start. Hours later, after scrolling through endless profiles and social media posts, he found him. Nate Radcliffe. Nate's profile was public, and it didn't take long for Martin to confirm it was the same man from the photo. Nate was tagged in posts by several of Clara's mutual friends, which corroborated her claim that he was a friend of a friend. But it was Nate's recent posts that sent Martin's heart racing. One of them, posted just a few days before the concert, showed Nate holding 2 tickets to the same event Clara had attended. The caption read, "Can't wait for a night of good music and great company." Martin stared at the post, his chest tightening. Clara had claimed she went to the concert alone. But if that were true, why did Nate have 2 tickets? When Clara came home that evening, Martin was waiting for her in the living room. His laptop sat open on the coffee table, Nate's post displayed prominently on the screen. "We need to talk," Martin said as Clara walked through the door. She paused, her eyes flicking to the laptop. "What now?" Martin gestured to the screen. "Care to explain this?" Clara walked over hesitantly, her face going pale as she read the post. "Martin, don't," Martin interrupted, his voice sharp. "Don't try to lie to me again. You said you went to the concert alone, but clearly that wasn't the case. So tell me the truth. Who is Nate to you?" Clara's hands trembled as she set her bag down. He's just a friend, she said weakly. Just a friend? Martin repeated, his tone dripping with disbelief. You're telling me you went to a concert with this guy, let him put his arm around you, and then conveniently forgot to mention it to me? Do you think I'm an idiot, Clara? Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't respond. Answer me! Martin shouted, his voice trembling with anger. Clara flinched, her tears spilling over. All right, she cried. I didn't go alone. Nate invited me. But it wasn't what you think. Martin's chest heaved as he tried to control his temper. Then what was it, Clara? Because from where I'm standing, it looks a hell of a lot like you've been sneaking around behind my back. I wasn't sneaking around, Clara insisted, her voice cracking. It was just a night out. I didn't think it mattered. Didn't matter? Martin repeated bitterly. You lied to me. You told me you were going alone, and then I find out you're at the concert with this guy? That doesn't matter to you? Clara sobbed, covering her face with her hands. I didn't know how to tell you, she whispered. Try the truth, Martin said coldly. That would have been a good place to start. The confrontation ended with Clara retreating to the bedroom, leaving Martin alone in the living room, his mind racing. Her tears and apologies felt hollow, overshadowed by her lies. He needed more answers. The next morning, Martin made a decision. He wasn't going to let this go until he knew the full truth. If Clara wasn't willing to come clean, he would find it himself. And he knew exactly where to start, Nate. Martin sat in his car outside Nate's apartment building, gripping the steering wheel tightly as he debated what he was about to do. Confronting Nate felt impulsive, even dangerous, but the questions swirling in his mind left him with little choice. Clara's evasions and half-truths had pushed him to the edge, and the only way to regain control was to confront the man who had upended his life. He checked the address he had found online one last time. This was definitely the place. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and walked toward the building's entrance. The door opened after a few knocks, revealing Nate standing in the doorway. He looked casual in a plain t-shirt and jeans, but the confident smile Martin had seen in his photos faded the moment their eyes met. Can I help you? Nate asked, his tone guarded. You're Nate, right? Martin said, keeping his voice steady. Yeah, and you are? Martin, Clara's husband. The color drained from Nate's face, and he took a step back, his posture stiffening. Look, man, I don't think this is a good idea. Too late for that. Martin interrupted, his voice cold. We need to talk. Now! Nate hesitated, glancing down the hallway before stepping aside reluctantly. Fine. Come in. The apartment was tidy but sparse, with minimal decorations and a few framed posters on the walls. Nate gestured for Martin to sit, but he remained standing, arms crossed, as the tension in the room thickened. What do you want to know? Nate asked, sitting on the armrest of his couch. Martin's jaw clenched. I want the truth. How long have you and Clara been? Whatever it is you've been doing. Nate's gaze shifted to the floor. It's not what you think, he said quietly. Then tell me what it is. Martin snapped. Because right now, it looks like my wife has been sneaking around with you behind my back. Nate sighed, running a hand through his hair. Look, we've been friends for a while. We met through mutual friends, started hanging out, and, yeah, I invited her to the concert. Friends don't keep secrets, Martin said, his voice rising. Friends don't lie to their spouses about who they're with. Nate hesitated, his guilt written across his face. She told me things were complicated between you two, he admitted. That she wasn't happy, that she felt stuck. Martin felt like he'd been punched in the gut. Stuck? He repeated bitterly. So you thought you'd swoop in and give her an escape? It wasn't like that, Nate said quickly. I didn't push her into anything. She came to me. And what exactly did she come to you for? Martin demanded. Because if this was just friendship, she wouldn't have lied to me about it. Nate shifted uncomfortably. We went to the concert. We hung out. We talked a lot. That's it. Just talked? Martin asked, his tone dripping with disbelief. Yes, Nate said firmly. I'm not saying it was right, but nothing physical ever happened. I swear. Martin studied Nate's face, searching for any signs of deceit. Part of him wanted to believe him, to believe that this wasn't as bad as it seemed. But the other part, the part consumed by anger and betrayal, refused to let go so easily. You're telling me you spent all the time with my wife, knowing she was unhappy, and you didn't try to take things further? Martin said, his voice cold. Nate held his gaze. I know it looks bad, but I'm not that guy. I didn't want to ruin her marriage. Martin let out a bitter laugh. Well, congratulations. You succeeded anyway. The conversation ended with Martin storming out of the apartment, his mind spinning. Nate's insistence that nothing physical had happened provided little comfort. Emotional betrayal was just as damaging, if not more so. As he drove home, Martin's thoughts returned to Clara. She had lied to him repeatedly, downplayed her connection with Nate, and kept him in the dark for months. How could he ever trust her again? When Martin walked through the door, Clara was waiting for him in the living room. She looked up, her face pale and anxious. Where were you? She asked hesitantly. With Nate, Martin said flatly. Clara's eyes widened, and she stood, her hands wringing nervously. What did he tell you? The truth, or at least his version of it? Martin replied, his voice sharp. That you've been talking to him about how unhappy you are, that you've been using him as some kind of emotional escape. Clara's face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks. Martin, I never meant to hurt you, she whispered. But you did, Martin said, his voice trembling with anger. You lied to me over and over again. You went behind my back, and now you're trying to justify it by saying you weren't happy? Do you have any idea how that makes me feel? Clara sobbed, her hands trembling. I know I messed up. I know I should have talked to you instead of turning to him. But nothing physical happened, Martin. I swear to you, it never went that far. Martin shook his head, his chest tight with anger and pain. It doesn't matter, Clara. The damage is done. You broke my trust, and I don't know if I can ever get it back. That night, Martin moved into the guest room, leaving Clara alone in their bedroom. The silence between them was deafening, and for the first time, Martin began to wonder if their marriage could survive this betrayal. The days after Martin's confrontation with Nate felt like they were moving in slow motion. The house was tense, every word exchanged between Martin and Clara loaded with unspoken accusations and lingering pain. Clara spent most of her time in their bedroom, while Martin buried himself in work, only coming home when he was sure the house would be quiet. But the silence was unbearable. One evening, after a particularly long day, Martin came home to find Clara sitting at the dining table. Her eyes were red and swollen, as though she'd been crying for hours. She looked up when he walked in, her hands trembling as she gripped a mug of tea. Martin, she said softly. He set his keys down and looked at her. What is it? We need to talk, Clara said, her voice breaking. Martin let out a bitter laugh. Now you want to talk? I've been trying, Clara said, tears spilling down her cheeks. But you won't even look at me. Please, Martin. I'm begging you to listen. How much trust is too much to lose in a relationship after betrayal? Write in the comments. Against his better judgment, Martin sat across from her, folding his arms. Fine. I'm listening. Clara took a shaky breath. I don't know how to explain what I've done without sounding like a terrible person, she began. But I need you to know that I never stopped loving you. Everything with Nate, it was a mistake. A huge, awful mistake. A mistake? Martin repeated bitterly. Mistakes happen once, Clara. This was a choice. Repeated choices? Clara nodded, her tears falling faster. You're right. It was a choice, and I made the wrong one. I let myself believe that talking to Nate was harmless, that it wouldn't affect us. But I was wrong, and I see that now. Martin leaned back, his jaw tight. What I don't understand is why. Why did you feel the need to turn to someone else? Why didn't you just come to me? Clara hesitated, her hands tightening around her mug. I was scared, she admitted. Scared that if I told you how I was feeling, it would hurt you. Or worse, that you wouldn't care. Martin's chest tightened. So you thought lying to me was better? Do you have any idea how much worse this is? I know, Clara whispered, and I hate myself for it. I hate what I've done to you, to us. But I need you to know that I'm done with Nate. I haven't spoken to him since that night, and I never will again. And I'm supposed to just take your word for it? Martin asked coldly. Clara flinched but nodded. Yes, because I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove to you that I'm serious about fixing this. Counseling, therapy, anything you want. Martin stood abruptly, his hand shaking. I don't know if this can be fixed, Clara. Do you even realize how much damage you've done? Every time I look at you, all I see is him. All I hear are your lies. Clara sobbed, reaching for him, but he stepped back. I need time, Martin said, his voice trembling. I need to figure out if I can even do this. Right now, I don't know if I can. Clara's tears fell harder as she nodded. Take all the time you need, she whispered. That night, Martin stayed in the guest room again. The bed was uncomfortable, and the silence of the house felt suffocating, but he couldn't bring himself to be near Clara. The betrayal was still too fresh, the wounds too raw. He spent the next few days avoiding her entirely, leaving early for work and coming home late. Clara sent him texts, small messages checking in or apologizing, but he ignored them all. One evening, Martin's brother, Eric, called. You sound like hell, Eric said after Martin answered. What's going on? Martin hesitated before replying. Clara, she's been lying to me. There's this guy, Nate, and she's been talking to him for months behind my back. Eric let out a low whistle. Damn. Did she admit it? Yeah, Martin said. She says it was just emotional, that nothing physical happened, but I don't know what to believe anymore. Man, that's rough, Eric said. What are you going to do? That's the problem, Martin admitted. I don't know. Part of me wants to forgive her, but the other part, I don't know if I'll ever be able to trust her again. Whatever you decide, just make sure it's what's best for you, Eric said. Don't let guilt or pressure push you into something you're not ready for. Martin nodded, his brother's words echoing in his mind long after the call ended. A week later, Clara came to Martin with a proposal. I've scheduled an appointment with a counselor, she said, her voice tentative. I thought maybe it could help us. If you're willing to go. Martin stared at her, his emotions swirling. Part of him wanted to reject the idea outright, to tell her there was nothing left to save. But another part, a quieter, more hopeful part, wondered if this could be a step toward rebuilding what they'd lost. All right, Martin said finally. I'll go. But don't think for a second that this means I've forgiven you. Clara nodded quickly, tears of relief filling her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. The first counseling session was awkward and painful, with both Martin and Clara struggling to express their emotions without descending into anger or blame. But as the weeks went on, the sessions began to feel more productive. Clara opened up about her feelings of dissatisfaction and fear, while Martin confronted his anger and hurt. The counselor helped them navigate their emotions, offering tools to rebuild trust and communication. But even as progress was made, Martin couldn't shake the lingering doubt in his mind. Could he ever truly forgive Clara? Could he ever see her as the woman he fell in love with, rather than the one who betrayed him? The weeks following the start of counseling felt like an emotional battlefield. Each session brought new revelations, forcing both Martin and Clara to confront the depths of their pain and the fractures in their marriage. Clara was unflinchingly honest, admitting to every lie, every omission, and every moment she had chosen Nate over Martin. For Martin, the transparency was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it felt like a step toward honesty. On the other, every confession deepened the wound. One evening, Martin sat in the guest room, staring at an old photo album Clara had left on the bedside table. It was filled with snapshots of their life together, vacations, birthdays, lazy Sundays spent in their backyard. In every photo, Clara's smile was radiant, her eyes full of joy. When did that change? Martin wondered. He flipped to a photo from their wedding day, the two of them beaming as they danced under a canopy of fairy lights. The memory felt distant now, almost like it belonged to another couple. The next morning, Martin sat across from Clara at the dining table. She looked up from her coffee, her expression wary. "We need to talk," Martin said. Clara set her mug down, her hands trembling slightly. "Okay." Martin took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about everything that's happened. And I need to be honest with you." Clara nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget what you did," Martin began, his voice calm but firm. "The lies, the betrayal, it's not something I can just move past. But I've realized that I don't want to give up on us without trying." Clara's breath hitched, and tears welled in her eyes. "That doesn't mean this is fixed," Martin continued. "It doesn't mean I forgive you yet. But I'm willing to keep going to counseling, to keep working on this, if you are." "Yes," Clara said quickly, her voice trembling. "Yes, I'll do whatever it takes, Martin. Thank you." Over the next few months, Martin and Clara focused on rebuilding their marriage. It wasn't easy. Trust wasn't something that could be restored overnight. There were setbacks, moments when Martin's anger bubbled over, or when Clara's guilt made her retreat into herself. But there were also small victories, honest conversations, shared laughter, and glimpses of the connection they once had. Clara cut all ties with Nate, blocking him on every platform and changing her social circles to avoid any contact with him. She was open with Martin in a way she never had been before, sharing her thoughts and feelings without hesitation. Martin, for his part, learned to voice his emotions instead of burying them. He leaned on his brother, Eric, for support and continued attending individual therapy sessions to process his pain. One evening, after a particularly candid counseling session, Martin and Clara sat on the back porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Max lay at their feet, his tail wagging lazily. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," Clara said softly, breaking the silence. Martin glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe not, but forgiveness isn't just about what you deserve. It's about what I need to move forward." Clara nodded, tears shining in her eyes. "I'll spend the rest of my life proving to you that you made the right choice by giving us another chance." Martin sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I don't know if I made the right choice yet, but I do know that I'm willing to find out. Months turned into a year, and while the scars of Clara's betrayal never fully disappeared, they began to fade. The marriage they rebuilt wasn't the same as the one they had before. It was rawer, more fragile, but also more honest. Martin learned to trust Clara again, though it was a slow process. And Clara, for her part, never stopped showing him that she was committed to earning that trust. One evening, as they danced in the living room to the same song that had played on their wedding night, Martin felt a flicker of hope. Their story wasn't perfect, but it wasn't over either.